It was a discovery that should have never been made, a secret that was never meant to see the light of day. In the autumn of 1886, deep in the piney woods of the Arkansas Ozarks, a surveyor named Elias Kline was running a line for the fledgling Fort Smith and Western Railroad. The work was grueling, the terrain unforgiving, a landscape of steep ridges and hollows that seemed to swallow the sky. Kline's chainman, a local boy named Silas, was the one who stumbled. He'd been hacking through a tangle of dogwood and briar when his boot caught on something solid. He reached down to pull it free, expecting a root or a rock. Instead, his fingers found the cold, smooth surface of a metal box, about the size of a thick ledger book, its surface crusted with a century's worth of grime. The men gathered around, their curiosity piqued. Kline prized the box open with his knife, the rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a collection of items that made the surveyor's blood run cold. A single, faded photograph of a young woman. A small, leather-bound diary, its pages swollen and damp. And, finally, a collection of documents that seemed official: land grants, property deeds, and a letter bearing the seal of the United States government. But it was a strange, hand-drawn map that truly captured their attention. It depicted a small settlement, a crossroads of sorts, with a church and a handful of buildings, all meticulously detailed. At the bottom, in a shaky, elegant script, were the words, "The place where we were forgiven." Elias Kline was a practical man, a man of mathematics and straight lines. But he knew the power of a good story, and he knew the history of these hills. He knew of the mountain gallows, a place whispered about in the hollers, a spot where frontier justice was dispensed, swift and final. What he didn't know was that he had just stumbled into the heart of one of the most deeply buried, haunting secrets of the American frontier. He had found a whisper of Mount Judea, a name that would consume the rest of his life. To understand the darkness of the Ozarks in 1886, you have to understand the soil. It's red, a deep, iron-rich crimson that seeps into your clothes, your hands, and under your fingernails. To the generation that came of age after the Civil War, it wasn't just dirt, it was blood. The war between the states had left an indelible mark on Arkansas, a state that was, by all accounts, a microcosm of the nation's divisions. In the mountains, families were torn apart, brother fighting brother in a guerrilla conflict that was as brutal as any battlefield. The war didn't just end in 1865, it transformed. The resentment festered. The old grudges became new feuds. This was a land where law was a suggestion, and justice, more often than not, was a bullet. Elias Kline was familiar with the stories of the Bald Knobbers, the vigilantes of the Missouri Ozarks, but here, the lawlessness had a different flavor. The settlers who clung to these mountains were fiercely independent, often descended from the Scots-Irish who had brought with them a profound distrust of central authority. They were a people who paid for their land with the sweat of their brow and expected to rule it with their own code. It was into this cauldron of post-war resentment and fierce independence that the discovery of the metal box dropped, a stone into a still, dark pond. Elias was staying at a boarding house in the burgeoning town of Harrison, run by a formidable widow named Mrs. Elara Tuttle. The evening of his find, he spread the contents of the box out on the parlor table. The diary, upon closer inspection, was a ledger of misery. It was written in a meticulous, looping hand, the ink faded to a watery brown. The entries were fragmentary, concerning the daily struggles of a small settlement, a failed harvest here, a fever there. But interspersed were confessions so stark they seemed to burn a hole in the page. One entry read, "The day was a testament to God's fury. We had not seen rain for 60 days, and the earth was as hard as the hearts of men. The cows gave no milk, and the children's stomachs groaned with hunger. I fear we have been forsaken." A man, a stranger, came into town offering a trade for a mule. The mule belonged to the widow Holland, a woman with no means, no recourse. The deal was done. But the stranger had a shadow in his eye, a darkness I had only ever seen in a Secesh soldier down in the bottoms. The Secesh was a reference to the secessionists, the Confederates. But this was 1886, 21 years after the war had ended. The ghosts of the conflict were still very much alive. The diary was written by a man who simply signed himself as J.B. He appeared to be a man of deep, tortured faith, a lay preacher perhaps, who was struggling to keep his flock together. His entries painted a picture of a community under immense strain, haunted by the violence of the recent past and the harsh realities of frontier life. The discovery of the box, the map, and the diary was a historical jackpot, a window into a forgotten world. But as Kline would soon discover, it was a window that looked out onto a nightmare. Elias Kline wasn't just a surveyor. He was a man on a mission. He had a deep, almost obsessive interest in history, and he had a particular skill that made him invaluable. He was one of the few people in the region who could read. He had been a clerk in a law office in Fayetteville before the war, and the craft of reading dusty documents was second nature to him. When he found the box, it wasn't just a curiosity, it was a calling. He made a pact with the widow Tuttle. He would look into the mystery of the box, and in return, he would tell her the story. Mrs. Tuttle was a good woman, a former schoolteacher who had buried 2 husbands and seen too much of the world's ugliness. She agreed, hoping the story would be one of redemption. Kline began his investigation. His first stop was the Newton County Courthouse, a modest brick building that smelled of old paper, dust, and mouse droppings. He searched the records for any mention of the settlement depicted on the map. The town wasn't there. It wasn't on any official survey. It was as if the place had been erased from the map. But he did find a curious entry in a ledger from 1866, just after the war's end. It was a property transfer for a piece of land. The land was described as being near the old ford of the Buffalo River. The buyer was a man named Levi Pritchett. The seller was a man named J.B. Kline's blood ran cold. The diary was signed J.B. Was this the same man? He tried to find a record of a J.B. named Pritchett, but there was nothing. The name wasn't even listed in the scant tax rolls of the era. It was as if Levi Pritchett had emerged from thin air and then vanished just as quickly. The only clue was the description of the land, a remote, hard-to-reach area near the river. On a crisp November morning, Elias and a reluctant Silas set out to find the old ford. The trail was overgrown, often disappearing entirely into dense thickets of blackberry and thorn. The silence of the woods was absolute, broken only by the cawing of a crow or the rustle of a squirrel. As they descended into a deep holler, the air grew heavy, the light dim. The trees were ancient, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, giving the place an almost subterranean quality. This was a place where the sun never seemed to shine, a pocket of perpetual twilight. It was a fitting location for the mountain gallows. There, in the middle of the hollow, stood the remains of a structure. It was a stout, wooden frame, about 15 feet high, with a single crossbeam at the top. The wood was weathered to a deep gray, and a rusty iron ring hung from the beam, swaying slightly in the breeze, as if it had only just been disturbed. This was it. The mountain gallows. The rumors were true. This was where justice was meted out, away from the prying eyes of any official court. But this was no ordinary gallows. Around it, scattered in the leaves and moss, were the remnants of a small settlement. The crumbled foundations of several cabins, a fallen church steeple, and a small, overgrown graveyard with a single, unmarked headstone. The map, the diary, the photograph, the pieces were starting to come together. But there was still one element missing, the identity of the woman in the photograph. The name of the woman was not in the diary. The only clue was a letter, found tucked inside the back cover of the diary. It was written on official letterhead, bearing the seal of the Department of the Interior. It was addressed to a Mrs. Rebecca Hargrave, confirming the transfer of a parcel of land near the Buffalo River. The letter was dated August 14, 1862, the height of the Civil War. So, there was a Rebecca Hargrave. But who was she to J.B.? Who was J.B.? And why was all of this hidden in a metal box, buried in the woods? The discovery of the gallows, the ruins, and the letter opened a Pandora's box of questions. Elias was no longer just a curious surveyor. He was an investigator, and he was beginning to understand that the silence of the woods was not peaceful. It was a secret kept. Elias's investigation began to stir the waters of Harrison. The county was a powder keg of old animosities. There were men who had fought for the Union, men who had fought for the Confederacy, and many who had tried to avoid the fight altogether. The war was over, but the scars were still raw. The discovery of the gallows and the diary was a threat to the fragile peace. One evening, while dining at Mrs. Tuttle's, Elias shared his findings with the other boarders. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. A local merchant, a man named Hiram Scoggins, went pale. He said nothing, but his wife, a nervous woman, suddenly found an urgent need to leave the room. A wagon driver, a grizzled old man who called himself Uncle Jasper, stared at Elias with a hard, cold gaze. "You'd best leave some stones unturned, young fella," he said, his voice a low growl. "Them hills have a long memory. And they don't take kindly to folks pokin' around in the past." That night, Elias was woken by a sound. A heavy rock crashed through his window, shattering the glass and landing on his pillow. Tied to the rock was a piece of paper. Scrawled in a crude hand was a message: "Cease your looking, or join them who sleep at the gallows." Elias reported the incident to the local sheriff, a weary man named Buck Hendricks. Hendricks listened patiently, his face a mask of indifference. "Kline," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I'd advise you to let this one go. You know as well as I do that the official records for that time are lost. The county records office burned down in '69. Everything from before that is gone. There's no proof of anything. Just some old stories. And stories are best left in the past." It was a brush off. The sheriff was more concerned with keeping the peace than with solving a 20-year-old mystery. The local government, it seemed, was not only uninterested but actively hostile. Kline began to realize that this was more than just the usual mistrust of outsiders. There was a conspiracy of silence. The town itself seemed to be complicit in hiding the truth. He turned to the local newspaper, the Harrison Herald. He hoped the editor, a man named Augustine Gus Rudabaugh, might be able to help. Gus was a tall, thin man with a sunken chest and a nervous twitch. He wore a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and he had a habit of cleaning them on his vest. He was the town's self-appointed historian, a man who knew the town's secrets and kept them buried in his pages. "Mr. Kline," Gus said, his voice trembling slightly, "the Newton County Historical Society, of which I am the president, is committed to preserving the truth. But there are some stories that are better left untold. They cause more harm than good. Forgive me, Mr. Rudabaugh, but a lynch mob and an erasure from the historical record is a story that I think needs telling," Kline said. "Lynch mob?" Gus laughed, a hollow, nervous sound. "My dear man, there is no record of a lynch mob in Newton County. We are a community of God-fearing, law-abiding citizens. There may have been misunderstandings, high tempers. But a lynch mob? Never. The records of the time are simply incomplete. Lost. Accidents." Kline wasn't satisfied. He started going through the Herald's archives. For a town of its size, the newspapers of the 1860s and 70s were strikingly barren of any mention of crime. There were no reports of arrests, no court proceedings, no reports of violence. It was as if the entire frontier had been populated by a community of saints. The omissions were so glaring, so systematic, that they were more damning than any confession. Someone had been scrubbing the town's history. They were not just hiding a secret, they were rewriting the past. But Kline found a clue in the most unassuming place. In the 1876 edition of the Herald, he found an advertisement for a saddle. It had been placed by a man named J.L. Hargrave. Could this be a relation to Rebecca Hargrave? He went to the county tax rolls, a dusty ledger in the county clerk's office. He looked up the property records for J.L. Hargrave. The property was a large tract of land just outside of town. The land records were current, suggesting J.L. Hargrave was still alive and living in the area. Finding J.L. Hargrave was the key. It had to be. Elias knew that if anyone could shed light on the mystery, it was this man. He was the only solid lead he had. The name was the only one that had emerged from the shadows of the archives. But the trail had gone cold for a reason. It was about to get a lot more complicated. Kline began asking around town. It took him a week to find anyone who knew the name. Finally, an old woman at the mercantile told him that J.L. Hargrave lived in a small cabin on a ridge overlooking the river valley. He was a recluse, she said. A man who kept to himself and saw no one. Elias set out to find him. The cabin was a pitiful sight. It was a one-room shack, made of split logs chinked with mud. The roof was caving in, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. A single hound dog, too old and weary to bark, raised its head as Elias approached. An old man answered the door. He was a skeleton wrapped in skin, his beard a wild tangle of white, his eyes deep-set and watery. This was J.L. Hargrave. He stared at Elias with a look of pure recognition, as if he had been expecting him. "You've come," the old man said, his voice a dry rustle. "I knew you would. I've been waiting for you." "Mr. Hargrave?" Elias asked, surprised. "That's me," he said. "What do you want?" "I found some things," Elias began, "a diary. A map. Things that belonged to a JB. I was hoping you could tell me who he was." The old man's face, already pale, went as white as the lintel. "JB," he whispered. "You found his things? You shouldn't have. You should never have found them." "Why? Who was he?" "His name was Jeremiah Bartholomew," the old man said, his voice cracking. "He was a preacher. A good man. But he got caught up in something he couldn't control." "Caught up in what?" The old man gestured for Elias to come inside. The cabin was dark and smelled of wood smoke and sickness. On the table was a half-eaten meal, a few crusts of bread and a cup of water. The man was clearly destitute, living on the edge of survival. "He was the one who wrote the diary," the old man continued, his eyes misting over. "But he didn't write it for you or me. He wrote it for his wife. For Rebecca. He wrote it to tell her what happened. To ask for her forgiveness. His wife. Rebecca." Elias's mind raced. His wife? The letter, the transfer of land. "Rebecca Hargrave was my mother," the old man said. "I'm her son. The son she had before she married Jeremiah." Elias felt the room spin. This was more than a historical mystery. It was a family drama, a decades-old tragedy. "Where is she now?" Elias asked. "She went away a long time ago," the old man said. "After Jeremiah was killed. She went to Oklahoma. She didn't want to live here anymore. There was too much shame." "Shame? For what? What happened to Jeremiah?" The old man took a long, shaky breath. "He was a Union man," he said. "In '62, during the war, he and a few others in the community didn't want to join the Confederacy. They tried to stay neutral. But there was a group of men here, the local vigilance committee, who thought they were all Secesh sympathizers. They were actually Confederate soldiers who'd come home to hide from the war. They called themselves the Mountain Men. They were the real law in these parts. And Jeremiah stood up to them." The investigation had taken a turn Elias hadn't expected. It was no longer about a lost settlement, but about the brutality of war and the darkness of the human heart. The mountain gallows, the forgotten town, these were the remnants of a war that had never truly ended. "They were going to hang him, weren't they?" Elias said, his voice low. "That's what the gallows are for." "They were," the old man said, a tear rolling down his leathery cheek. "They were going to hang him for being a Union man. But he escaped. He got away. He ran and he hid. But they took his wife, Rebecca. They said they'd spare him if he came back. They set a trap. Dear God, Elias breathed. Jeremiah was a man of conviction. He was a preacher. He knew right from wrong. He knew they'd kill him, but he couldn't let them harm Rebecca. He turned himself in. He walked into that hollow all by himself. And they hanged him. Elias looked around the desolate cabin. The man was living in the shadow of a brutal, unjust death. The family's land was gone, their name disgraced. The silence of the community hadn't been a choice, it had been a weapon. You said they were a vigilance committee, Elias said. Who led them? The old man looked down at his hands, his knuckles white. The leader, he said, his voice a bitter whisper, was a man named Hiram Scoggins. Hiram Scoggins. The local merchant. The man who had gone pale in Mrs. Tuttle's parlor. The man who was now a wealthy, respected pillar of the community. The leader of the lynch mob. And he was still living in Harrison, a free man. Elias Kline sat in the oppressive silence of the cabin, the old man's words echoing in his head. A respected member of the community, Hiram Scoggins, the man who sold supplies to the railroad and donated to the church, was the head of a lynch mob. It was a devastating revelation. For the first time, Elias understood the true depths of the conspiracy. The silence wasn't just about forgetting, it was about protecting a murderer. The old man, J.L. Hargrave, provided a name. Scoggins. It was a local family name, but the old man spoke of him as the leader of a group, the Vigilance Committee. He couldn't provide any evidence beyond the word of a dying man, but it was enough to give Elias a direction. He needed to find a way to implicate Scoggins legally. Over the following weeks, Elias became a regular fixture at the Harrison Herald. He spent his evenings poring over the faded pages of the newspaper, looking for any mention of the name Scoggins or any hint of the violence that had occurred in the valley. It was in a late edition of the paper, dated October 1865, that he found something. It was a small, almost insignificant article. It was a legal notice, placed by a Hiram Scoggins, about a dispute over a mule. The article was unremarkable, but it contained a detail that sent a shiver down Elias's spine. The mule in question was described as a dapple-gray jenny. It was the same description used in the diary, the mule that the stranger with the shadow in his eye had traded for. But there was more. The article said the dispute was settled out of court. There was no record of a trial. Hiram Scoggins had the power to not only break the law but to make the official record of it disappear. He had friends in high places. It was a terrifying thought. He was not just a murderer, he was a man who could control the legal system itself. Elias had a plan. He couldn't prove the murder, not with the evidence he had. But he could confront Scoggins. He could make him squirm, let him know that someone was on his trail. He set up a meeting with Scoggins in his store. The store was a testament to Scoggins's success. It was a large, well-stocked establishment with a polished wooden floor and glass display cases. It was a far cry from the dusty, ramshackle general stores that dotted the frontier. Scoggins himself was a heavy-set man with a thick beard and small, calculating eyes. He wore a fine suit and a gold watch. "Mr. Kline," Scoggins said, his voice smooth as silk. "What can I do for you? Looking for some new supplies for the railroad survey?" "No, Mr. Scoggins," Elias said, his voice firm. "I'm not here to buy supplies. I'm here to talk about the past." Scoggins's face remained a mask of affability, but Elias saw a flicker of something in his eyes. A shadow. A warning. "The past?" Scoggins said, feigning ignorance. "What about the past?" "The town of Mount Judea," Elias said. "And the man you hanged, Jeremiah Bartholomew." The color drained from Scoggins's face. He looked around the store, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. His composure was gone. He was exposed. "I don't know what you're talking about," Scoggins said, his voice a low hiss. "There is no town called Mount Judea. And I never hanged anyone." "You're lying," Elias said, his voice rising. I have the diary. I have the testimony of J.L. Hargrave. I know what you did. Scoggins' eyes darted around the room. He was a cornered animal. Then, he did something unexpected. He sat down heavily on a wooden crate, his bravado gone. He looked old and tired, his mask of civilization stripped away. You want the truth, Kline? Scoggins said, his voice a broken whisper. Fine. You want to hear it? I'll tell you. He was a radical. A troublemaker. He was poisoning the minds of the people against the Confederacy. He was going to bring the Union Army down on us. We were trying to protect our families, our way of life. We tried to reason with him. But he was stubborn. Pig-headed. He wouldn't listen. So you killed him, Elias said, his voice cold. You murdered him in cold blood. It was war, Scoggins said, his voice trembling. It was war. You don't understand the fear. The hatred. We were fighting for our lives. He was a traitor. He deserved to die. And his wife, she was a problem too. A troublemaker. She had to be silenced. Silenced? Elias repeated. What do you mean, silenced? What happened to Rebecca Hargrave? Scoggins looked at Elias, his eyes filled with a strange, bitter regret. She was a woman with a big mouth and a stubborn streak. She wouldn't let it go. She kept talking. She tried to get the authorities involved. She was a threat to the whole community. So we made a mistake. We wanted to get rid of the problem. But it was an accident. She got hurt. We didn't mean for it to happen. But she was taken away. She died a few months later. Elias was speechless. This wasn't just a lynching. It was a kidnapping. A conspiracy. A cover-up. The secrets of Mount Judea were deeper and darker than he had ever imagined. Scoggins had not only killed a man, he had terrorized his family and erased them from history. You're a monster, Elias said. Scoggins looked at him with eyes that held no remorse. I was a man trying to survive, he said. I did what I had to do. You would have done the same. Elias emerged from the store, his mind reeling. He had his confession, but it was a confession made in private, with no witnesses. It meant nothing. Scoggins would deny it. And now, he was a man with a target on his back. He walked to the boarding house, his head down, his thoughts churning. He didn't notice the men following him until it was too late. He was halfway up the street when he felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart in his throat. It was a group of 3 men. 2 of them were strangers, but the third was the wagon driver, Uncle Jasper, the old man who had warned him to leave the past alone. You should have listened, boy, Jasper said, his eyes glinting in the moonlight. You should have let well enough alone. What do you want? Elias said, his voice trembling slightly. We want you to leave, Jasper said. You're going to get on the next train out of here, and you're going to forget everything you heard. If you don't, you'll end up like JB. Your body will be food for the buzzards in the hollow. Or, another man said, a younger man with a cruel smile, you could join that old fool Hargrave. He's seen his last sunset. A cabin fire is a tragedy, but these hills are full of them. The threat was clear. They were going to kill the old man. They were going to burn the evidence. Elias had no doubt they were capable of it. They'll be watching you, Jasper said. We'll be watching you. You have until sundown tomorrow. The men melted back into the shadows, leaving Elias standing alone in the street, his heart pounding in his chest. He was being stalked by ghosts from the past. The mountain men were still here, their power undiminished. Elias spent a sleepless night at the boarding house, his mind racing. He was caught in a trap. The confession, the evidence, the threats, they all circled in his head. He felt like he was trapped in the diary, in the ancient, dark heart of the Ozarks. The next morning, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't save the old man. They'd already made the threat. He couldn't stop them. But he could try to save something. He could try to preserve the truth. The diary, the map, the photograph, they were all the evidence he had. They were a testament to a terrible crime. He couldn't let them be destroyed. He went to the newspaper office. Gus Rudabaugh was there, looking even more frail and nervous than usual. "Mr. Kline," Gus said, his voice trembling. "I have heard rumors. Disturbing rumors." "I need you to do something for me," Elias said, his voice urgent. "I have evidence. Evidence of a crime. A murder that took place in 1862. I need you to print it. I need you to expose the truth." Gus looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. "You want me to run a story accusing Hiram Scoggins of lynching a man," he said, his voice a whisper. "I do," Elias said. "I have the diary. I have a witness. And I have a confession from Scoggins himself. You're a newspaperman. It's your job to expose the truth." "But, Mr. Kline," Gus said, wringing his hands. "I can't. If I print that, they'll burn my press. They'll kill me. They've already killed a man for less. The Vigilance Committee is more powerful than the law. They are the law." "I understand the danger," Elias said. "But you have a choice. You can be a coward and let this crime be forgotten, or you can be a man of conscience and do what's right." Gus looked down at his hands, his face a mask of fear. He was a man torn between his duty as a journalist and his survival. He had always known about the deep, dark secrets of the town. He had always known that the silence was a lie. He had always been afraid to tell the truth. "All right," Gus said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it. But not today. I'll do it next week. I need time to prepare." Elias knew it was a stall. But he had no other options. He couldn't force him. He just had to hope that Gus would find the courage he needed. A week passed. The atmosphere in Harrison was tense, like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Elias stayed in the boarding house, rarely leaving his room. He was a man walking on eggshells. He was waiting. On the 7th day, he received word that the newspaper was out. He walked to the Herald office with a sense of dread. The doors were locked. The windows were dark. A crowd had gathered outside. "What happened?" Elias asked a man in the crowd. "Rudabaugh's dead," the man said. "They found him this morning. Shot dead in his printing office. Looks like a robbery." Elias felt his stomach sink. It was a message. A message that they were serious. They had silenced the only journalist in town. He forced his way through the crowd. Inside, he found Gus Rudabaugh slumped over his desk, a bullet hole in his temple. On the desk, next to him, was the latest edition of the Herald. It was half-printed. The front page carried a story. It was the story Elias had tried to get him to print. The headline read, "The Forgotten Lynching of 1862." But the story had been buried. It was cut short by the bullet. Elias looked down at the half-printed page. It was a skeleton, but it was enough. The seeds of the story were now in the hands of the people of Harrison. The truth, even a partial truth, was out there. But for Elias, it was too late. He was a marked man. That evening, as he walked back to the boarding house, he saw a group of men on the street. They were waiting for him. The mountain men. They didn't approach him. They just stood there, in the shadows, watching him. A message that was louder than words. He had a choice. He could leave, or he could die. He knew then that the story of Mount Judea would never be fully told. Not in his lifetime. The truth had been found, but it had been buried again, deeper than before. The conspiracy was too powerful. The secrets were too dark. He couldn't fight the shadows. 2 weeks later, Elias Kline sat on the roof of a train, heading west. The wind was cold in his face, but the cold he felt inside was colder. The land rolled by, a blur of green and brown, but all he could see was the face of the old man in the cabin, and the hollow eyes of Hiram Scoggins. He had left Harrison in the dead of night, taking with him only what he could carry. He had left behind the diary, the map, and the photograph. He had left them with Mrs. Tuttle, asking her to keep them safe, to keep the secret alive. He had given up on justice, but he couldn't give up on the truth. He looked out over the landscape, a land of deep valleys and mist-shrouded mountains. It was a beautiful land, but it was also a haunted one. It was a land of secrets, a land of ghosts. He had found a truth buried in the woods, but he had also found that some truths are too terrible to bear. He had seen the darkness at the heart of the frontier, a darkness that was still alive, waiting for its next victim. He had gone looking for answers, but he had only found more questions. Who was Rebecca Hargrave? What had happened to her? Was she the woman in the photograph? Who was J.L. Hargrave? Was he the boy in the photograph? The questions ate away at him, the ghosts of Mount Judea whispering in his ear. The diary had been a testament to faith and forgiveness. The place where we were forgiven. But for whom? For the community that had allowed a murder to happen? For the men who had stood by while a man was hanged? For the conscience of a town that had sold its soul to survive? Or was it simply a last, desperate plea from a dying man, a man who was trying to find forgiveness for a sin he didn't commit? Elias would never know. The truth of Mount Judea was buried deeper than any diary. The secrets of the mountain men were safe for now. But the story haunted him. It was a story of the American frontier, a story of violence and silence, a story that would be told again and again, a story that could never be silenced forever. Years later, Elias Kline would write his own account of those days. It was a short, simple story, a story that would become a local legend, passed down from generation to generation. He called it The Mountain Gallows. He began the story with the discovery of the box, the diary, and the map. He told of the lynchings, of the conspiracy, of the threat of the mountain men. He ended his story with his own escape, with the image of the mountains fading into the distance. And then, he added a final, haunting line. It was a question that had haunted him for the rest of his life. It was the question that lingered after the discovery, after the investigation, after the revelations, after the tragedy. It was the question that had no answer. Who was the woman in the photograph? The question hung in the air, unanswered. A whisper from the past, lost to the silence of the hills. The mystery of Mount Judea remained. A secret kept. A truth buried. A story untold. The land had swallowed the truth whole, leaving behind only the ghosts of the forgotten. The frontier had its secrets. And some secrets, it seemed, would never be laid to rest.